The post-Cold War boom was unique in human history in many ways. Usually when an empire crashed, whatever part they played in the regional economic system crashed along with it, because production of raw materials was limited and usually consumed locally. Any sort of manufactured goods were usually consumed locally. There was very little trade among these systems. But with the post-Cold War system, we tried something fundamentally new. We had a collapse in the Soviet industrial base, but we did not have a corresponding collapse in the former Soviet agricultural base or its capacity to produce raw materials such as crude oil, natural gas, aluminum, and so on. So for the last 35 years, the sum total of all of that excess output was just dumped on the global system. And it's a big part of why global inflation has been so low for so long. The oil was cheaper than it should have been. The wheat was cheaper than it should have been. The palladium and the platinum and the bauxite was cheaper than it should have been. And the rest of the world was able to gorge on those raw materials to generate the heyday of globalization that we all know and love. Well, without those items, growth would have at most been half of what we experienced. Inflation would have been significantly higher, and now we get to go through all of this in reverse in a very short period of time. Any sector in any country that experienced runaway growth for the past 30 years must now be reevaluated. And these sectors and these countries need to take a good hard look at why they were able to be so successful. And if a big piece of it was because the commodity prices that fueled their activity were low, they now have to unwind 30 years of progress in the next few months. This is Chinese and German manufacturing. This is the energy transition and the digital revolution. And this is Brazilian and South Asian agriculture. This is one of my favorite and most depressing graphics that was first put together 6 years ago, 2016. The blue and the green are the world's major exporters of grain-based calories, or grain plus soy. Everyone else is a net importer. And any country in orange or red imports at least half of the calories that they consume. In the world we're going into with broken supply chains, every country that has an X on it is looking at least a minimum of a 40% reduction in their ability to grow the crop in the first place because of lack of inputs. That assumes that there's no broad-scale breakdown in transport, just from a lack of inputs. Now, this was put together in 2016. The only change that we have had since then is that Venezuela has gone from orange to red. Everything else, in my opinion, stands. We're now a lot closer to this end result, and this presentation in many ways is about updating everyone as to where we are on the road to this map. So, of course, let's talk about the big picture. A little bit smaller than the big picture. The hashed red lines are where the Russians believe their ideal borders should be. If they can reach out to all of those hashed lines, then they will have plugged several of the gateway territories that historical foes have used to invade the Russian Federation. There's 9 of those gateways. In this particular map, you're talking the Baltic Sea, the Polish Gap, the Bessarabian Gap, and the coastal approaches through the Caucasus. Ukraine is on the way to 2 of those gaps, the one in Poland and the one in Bessarabia, which is part of Moldova and Romania. The Russians are not going to stop until they control all of Ukraine, and they're not going to stop when they control all of Ukraine. Ukraine is simply a step along the road for them. So we have to talk about what this means for Ukraine in agriculture. Based on whose numbers you're using, Ukraine is either the world's 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th largest agricultural exporter. Value, weight, depends upon how you focus on things. But here's where we are for the war right now. The red lines indicate the major thrusts. The blue lines are lines of contact where there's been heavy fighting. And the shaded pink are where the Russians have, I don't want to call it control, but they certainly have significant military forces. The 2 thrusts that we've been seeing the most of in the news are the heavy shelling that is going on in the capital of Kiev and the city of Kharkiv. Now, those are Russia's 2 biggest cities. I have no doubt that in time they will fall. Whether this is this week or 3 months from now, I have no idea. There's too much moving around. But from the point of view of agriculture, these are the 2 more important fronts. First, Mariupol, which has now been under siege since the 3rd day of the war. And second, Odessa, which is clearly the Russians' end result of their Western push. Once Mariupol falls, regular troops from Russia, not part of the 200,000 that we prepositioned, but regular Russian troops will start flowing through that southern coastal approach past Mariupol to Crimea. They'll take out Mykolaiv and eventually take Odessa. Now, Odessa is the commercial capital. It is the single largest wheat loading facility in the world. And once Odessa falls, the Ukrainians will have lost all maritime frontage, and it will be much more difficult for them to bring in the drones from Turkey that they've kind of fallen in love with because they work so well. Now, I don't think it's likely that Russia is going to complete the subjugation of Ukraine until at least late summer. And even then, we just have the start of what will be a multi-year, extensive partisan resistance. Most estimates, and granted, most estimates were probably put together in the first day of the war, not really realizing how bad this was going to be. But most estimates out, either from the FAO internationally or for U.S. Department of Agriculture domestically, are only estimating a 20% or 30% reduction in Ukraine's output as opposed to last year. That's wildly over-optimistic. Exports are not simply going to go to zero. Ukraine will become a net importer this year. A few reasons for that. Number one, Russia is deliberately destroying any towns that can. The goal for here is so that any future guerrilla support infrastructure is preemptively wrecked. It's smart, I guess, from a certain point of view, but it also destroys all of the support infrastructure for agriculture. Second, Ukraine never really had a big industrial base. Most of their output is in large scale dependent upon imported inputs: capital, seeds, machinery, fertilizer. None of that can make it in. The Ukrainians are not going to plant this year. And those two factors are more than enough to ensure that Ukraine is not just going to not plant this year, but also next year. They may be able to harvest some of their winter wheat when it is ready in June and July, but none of that will be for export. This is going to be the beginning of a 1980s style Ethiopia famine, what used to be one of the world's largest food exporter. And then third, of course, Odessa is going to fall under Russian control. And if the Russians treat Odessa anything like they have treated every other population center they've come across, it's going to be shelled, and most of the port infrastructure will probably be destroyed. The road and rail infrastructure in and out of the city certainly will be destroyed.
The Germans have become so addicted to inexpensive, reliable natural gas supplies out of Europe, or out of Russia, that they base their entire economic system on it. So the natural gas doesn't just provide them with power. It's the base material for the entire petrochemical system. And then that petrochem stuff is, for the most part, net exported. It's the base of their entire manufacturing model. The infrastructure's been destroyed, and some of the backup stuff all go through the conflict zone. So, it's not coming back at all. And even if they bring it in an LNG form, it'll be 6 times the cost of the old stuff.